Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. And also, as always, if I don't answer your question in this video, then go ahead and copy and paste it onto the bottom of this Patreon post. Also, don't forget to post any new questions that you have, as well as like all the posts that you want answered, because I generally answer the questions in order of how many likes they have. So let's jump right in. Liam Walker asks, hey Matt, what are your thoughts on improving listening comprehension, where rather than letting the show continue in a free flow state, you pause after each line of dialogue that you weren't able to parse and repeat that line over and over again, trying to really scrutinize the sounds, and only then looking at the subtitle to see what you've missed. Do you think there is any benefit to this sort of highly focused listening practice, or would it be more beneficial to just put in the hours and let your ear slowly get used to the sounds? So yeah, I actually do think that this type of exercise would probably be very beneficial for listening ability in particular. From what I've seen and experienced, when you're doing very active listening, when you're really trying to stretch your ears and challenge yourself and consciously hear as much as you can, that does seem to lead to listening ability improving faster than it would otherwise if you're kind of just sitting back and relaxing. So I definitely think this would be beneficial. The one caveat that I would say is you don't want to be in this mode where you're always rewinding many times whenever you miss something all the time, because that's going to inhibit your ability to tolerate ambiguity, and that's going to get in the way later on down the line. And also, I think that even just from an acquisition standpoint, it's important to have some periods of time where you're just letting yourself miss things, because that will teach your brain that it's important to be able to understand things the first time, because sometimes in life you only have one shot. So basically, I would say it's probably a good idea, if this type of practice appeals to you, to do this type of very active listening practice during your intensive immersion, but make sure you always have a separate time for free flow immersion where you're not pausing and not looking things up, so that you can, first of all, build tolerance to ambiguity, and also teach your brain that sometimes you only get one shot, particularly when you're having a real conversation in real life. And so it's important to be able to understand things the first time, and teaching your brain that is probably going to lead you to overall acquire the language more quickly, because your brain will realize the importance of getting really good at the language. So Lena Beam asks, something I have found disappointing is the lack of nuanced scientific research about second language acquisition. I, and surely many others, am curious to understand the nitty-gritty mechanics of exactly how acquisition works. I remember you asked Krashen during the interview if he knew anything about the black box that's responsible for us acquiring language, and he replied that he did not. Do you think there is a possibility we may eventually see more research in this field? It would be helpful for an overwhelming percentage of the global population if we had empirical scientific data that helped us decode the acquisition process and understand how we can better optimize our learning to acquire languages as efficiently as possible. Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is I'm actually not very versed in the field of second language acquisition or language acquisition in general. It's a whole academic field that has a lot of research being created in it. So I can't really talk on the current state of exactly what the field looks like. I do know that within the field of second language acquisition, a lot of people have kind of built on Krashen's ideas and added a lot of things onto it. And so that's why Krashen's original ideas are no longer taken that seriously, because there's kind of a lot of situations where input alone is not enough. And I've talked about that a lot on my channel, like pitch accent would be an example of that. And so, yeah, I can't really speak on this because I don't really even know how much of a lack there is of research. I have heard some research that is talking about what the brain's actually doing while someone is parsing language, and they have pretty cool research that shows like what part of the brain is active at the millisecond level when you're listening to language, in terms of first parsing the sounds and then determining what word it is, and kind of the top-down, bottom up processes working together to parse sentences and things like that. So I know there's something there, but I think ultimately we're just kind of bottlenecked by our understanding of the brain in general, because language acquisition is such a complicated phenomenon. I mean, just understanding language in general is very complicated, right? Let alone how your brain learns to understand language. There's so many factors at play, like psychological and motivational factors, what input your brain's actually getting, what your current knowledge is at a certain point in time. How do you measure people's knowledge at a certain point in time? How do you measure when the knowledge has changed? How do you measure people's intuition versus what they know consciously? It's such a complicated equation And actually what I've heard is that in the field of second language acquisition, normally people don't just try to study this whole thing at once because it's not really feasible to do so. Instead, there's people who specifically look at how motivation and psychological factors affect things, and there's other people that look specifically at what's going on in the brain and so on. So yeah, I think there probably is a lot of research that's happening in the second language acquisition field that would provide insights into how we can change our learning, but it does seem pretty limited, and I think that's just due to how complicated of a phenomenon language and language acquisition is. I imagine that at some point in the future, we'll know much more than we know now, but it's hard to say what that is or when that might be, especially because, like I said, I'm not that versed in the field of second language acquisition. It's something I want to learn more about, and I plan on learning more about in the future because I think it would help give me more insights into how we can improve the process. But overall, in my experience, studying something academically and actually doing something are really different. So, I mean, I think that if you took a linguist who studies second language acquisition for a living, compared to, but has never actually reached a high level in a foreign language, versus someone who maybe they've never studied linguistics, but they have learned a language to a high level, the person who's actually learned a language is going to have a lot more practical insight on how to actually learn a language. But ideally, you'd have someone who has both, right? So hopefully I can become that person in the future. So Chris asks, Matt, can you do the tongue twister from Bakemonogatari? So I'm pretty sure that this person is referring to this scene from this anime.
猫、僕が今から言う文章を復唱しろ。斜め77度の並びで、泣く泣くいななく7半7台、難なく並べて長々め。
斜め77度の並びで、にゃくにゃくいななく7半7台、なんにゃく並べて長々め。
Okay, here goes. 斜め77度の並びで、泣く泣くいななく7半7台、難なく並べて長々め。And for anyone who wants to know what that means, my personal translation is staring at 7 reluctantly roaring motorcycles that you effortlessly arranged in a line such that each is angled diagonally at 77 degrees. So Lamont asks, hey Matt, to what extent do you think one becomes kind of an expert in a language after reaching solid fluency, just by osmosis? I know you said after reaching your current level of Japanese after about 5 years, or I know you said you reached your current level of Japanese after about 5 years, but it strikes me that there's very little that you don't know about Japanese, including different dialects and where cities are, etc. Compared with learning a language, this knowledge seems easy to pick up, but I think we underestimate how much it adds up and makes its way into someone's speech so that they're even more competent. Like yourself, for example, now after 11 years rather than 5. To give a very different example, I spoke to a Polish woman who's been learning Swedish for 18 years, but teaching it for 14 years. Unlike you, she never had a very deliberate approach to it. She just did a college course and then basically immersed in Swedish culture since then. Despite this, her Swedish is nearly flawless, and I wonder how much of that is just the tiny little filling in of the cracks over the last 14 years. I doubt she was this good 14 years ago when she started teaching, but it would be hard for most to say in what way they'd improved in that time. Could you please give us your thoughts on this? Yeah, so basically you're asking about, after reaching a level of strong fluency, to what extent do you just continue to improve naturally by continuing immersion and just get, absorb things through osmosis? So actually the first thing that comes to my mind when I read this question was a recent interview that I just filmed with someone named Nick, who is one of the best foreign speakers of Japanese that I've ever heard. He is like probably the closest to being native level all around of any like Westerner I've heard that taught themselves Japanese. And he's been living in Japan for 10 years. And I asked him about or I should back up and say, when he arrived in Japan, he'd already been studying pretty intensely for many years. So he already had basic fluency when he arrived in Japan, but he obviously improved a lot over the last 10 years. He wasn't at a near native level like he is right now when he first arrived in Japan. So I kind of asked him, to what extent were you consciously trying to improve your ability or studying to improve versus just living in the language and having things happen naturally? And what he basically said was, and you can go and watch the full interview, is that basically he wasn't doing a lot of conscious studying or conscious work to improve his Japanese, but whenever he was using Japanese or listening to Japanese, he just kind of had this stance of wanting to make sure that he was getting everything. Like he said that he felt very strongly that whenever he communicated to a Japanese person, he doesn't want the communication to be compromised due to a lack of ability on his end. He doesn't want the other person to feel unsure whether that he's understanding everything, and he doesn't want the person to feel like he has to dumb down his speech and things like this. And so he always was just kind of tuned in, trying to make sure he's picking up everything, filling in any cracks. And so it kind of sounded like, although he wasn't consciously studying or consciously doing things to improve, just the overall mindset and stance that he had towards the language, which was one of, the opposite of complacency, wanting to improve, basically wanting to be perfect, basically, I think led to him picking up a lot more from his immersion. Whereas there's other people who they reach a certain point and are just satisfied. Like they feel completely satisfied with their ability and that they have no need to get any better. It's like in their mind, they kind of just think of it as, I beat the game. There's no more to be done here. And so they get complacent and they stop having that mindset of trying to pick up anything that they're missing or just tune into as much detail as possible. And I think those people are the ones who fossilize and stop getting better despite how, maybe having a lot of additional immersion after that point. And so I really think that after reaching basic fluency, the amount in which you're going to continue to pick up through osmosis by continuing immersion depends a lot on your mindset. If you're someone who is motivated and has a desire to be as good as possible, you're just naturally going to pick a lot of things up. Whereas if you kind of flip that switch in your mind and move into like, I already beat the game mode, then you're probably not going to be picking that stuff up. Because again, your brain, you can either say it's efficient or you could say it's lazy, right? It doesn't want to do work it doesn't have to do. It's not going to just be running the pattern recognition algorithms meaninglessly just cause. So if your motivation isn't there as an emotional incentive for your brain to be burning extra calories to try to absorb more of the language, it's probably not going to be doing that. So that's kind of my conclusion based on everything that I've seen. Really, fossilization, the number one cause of fossilization seems to be a lack of a desire to improve. And that seems to apply to almost every front in the language, like pronunciation, grammar, usage, and everything. So Calvin Leeds asks, hey Matt, so I've been learning with the JP1K deck and I've been really proud of my commitment, but I made a mistake. When I started the deck, I only memorized the meanings of each card and disregarded the reading. Now I've stopped new cards every day to try to catch up, but it's hard. I have about 150 reviews a day, but it's hard to go through them all. Since I'm now trying to memorize the readings, it feels like I have 100 new cards a day. The only thing I can do is to start over, but I don't really want to. All this extra review is making it hard for me to focus on getting my reviews done. Should I stop focusing on learning those readings for the old cards and just do it for any new cards I get, or is this a bad idea? Any input you have would be greatly appreciated. So yeah, Calvin, doesn't seem like listening to instructions is your strength because you were not following the instructions initially and you're not following the instructions now. So there's very particular review instructions for the JP1K deck, and those very particular review instructions are itself the innovation that constitutes this deck. So what it is for each card on the front, there's a word written in full kanji, and your first goal is to try to recall the reading. After you've done your best to try to recall the reading, you hover your mouse over the word, and the reading will be shown to you. After that, you then recall the meaning. And once you have done your best to recall the meaning, you look at the back of the card and you confirm whether you correctly recall the meaning or not. Then when you grade the card, you only grade the card based on how well you were able to recall the meaning, not the reading. So you're not supposed to completely disregard the reading. You're also not supposed to grade yourself on whether you can remember the reading or not. That's supposed to be something that kind of happens naturally over time as you go through the deck. So yeah, what I would recommend doing is just start following the actual review instructions of the deck. For every single card, try to recall the reading, but even if you're not able to, don't make that part of the grading criteria. If as long as you were able to recall the meaning, then grade the card good. And I'd say if you're already almost finished with the deck, then you kind of missed out on your opportunity to get the benefit of the JP1K, but depending on how far you are through the deck, then it's possible that just by switching to the correct way of reviewing, or at least the recommended way of reviewing, I should say, that you'll be fine by the time you finish the deck. So you didn't really say how far into the deck you are, so I can't really say for sure. If you're almost done with the deck and you haven't reached kanji fluency yet because you were disregarding the instruction related to attempting to recall the readings of kanji, then you might want to just start the deck over. But if you're less than halfway through, then I would say just start following the instructions and you'll probably be fine. So Joshua asks, I've got a question about listening comprehension. When I'm listening to my target language, I am almost always able to clearly hear all the words that I know. However, when I hear words that I don't know, I can never seem to hear them properly. Why is this? So I have a video that dives into this topic pretty deeply. It's called Why You Still Can't Understand Your Target Language, and it's probably overall my best video. So I highly recommend watching it if you haven't seen it yet. But the kind of summarized gist is that when you're listening to a language and you're trying to understand it, two processes are happening simultaneously, a top-down process and a bottom-up process. So the bottom-up process is the more obvious one. It's the process of your brain actually listening to the sound signal that your ear picked up and breaking it up into consonants and vowels, as well as stress and pitch and other features, and trying to combine whatever vowels and consonants and stuff it picked up into words. So if you hear like the sound b, a, b, then your brain puts that together and says Bob. Okay, that was someone's name. But while this process is happening, there's actually a top-down process, which is guessing what words are likely to be being said based on the little bits and pieces that you pick up combined with the overall context. So for example, if I said, it's always hard to come up with examples like this off the top. Let me think of like a really obvious example, like third time's a blank, it's going to be charm, right? Third time's a charm. And so even if you weren't able to make out all the sounds of the charm, I said third time's a charm, you would know that I said charm because of the context. So a lot of what's happening when you're listening to language is your brain is combining what it's picking up on a sound level with guesses based on the context and your understanding of what's likely to be said in the current situation. And one kind of proof, you might say, that shows that this top-down process plays a big role in comprehending spoken language is these three sentences. So I sent her a letter, I led her to water, and I let her go out late at night, right? So if you're a native English speaker or a fluent English speaker, you effortlessly understood these three sentences. But if you look carefully, the letter or let her, led her portion were pronounced identically in all three. Sent her a letter, I let her go to the store, I led her to the water. And so the reason why your brain was able to understand one was let her, one was led her, and one was let her is based on the surrounding context. Your brain just automatically combines its knowledge of English and the surrounding context to deduce what was said, even though there is inherent ambiguity in the sounds alone. So going back to your specific problem, the reason why when you know a word, you can hear it, but when you don't know the word, you can't hear it, is probably because your brain hasn't fully developed the ability to perceive all the subtle sounds in your target language. Maybe you can only hear the sounds like 70% or something. And so when you combined hearing 70% of a word with the knowledge of what the word is, that's probably enough to figure it out. And what happens here is, from your perspective, it just sounds like you heard it. Like in reality, your brain, what you experience consciously is not the raw sounds your ears picked up, but a modified version of the sounds that your brain created by combining the sounds with your knowledge of how the language sounds. So, for example, have you ever been listening to someone talk, they say something that you couldn't make out and you say, "What?" And then before they repeat what they just said, you retroactively realize what it is that they said. And it's almost like at first it was blurry in your mind, but then it just got clear. And like retroactively, you like heard it differently than when it first hit your ear. And what this shows is, again, what you experience consciously is not the raw sounds. It's an edited version of your sounds that has already been edited by, or almost like photoshopped in a way, like auditorily photoshopped by your unconscious mind to match what it has determined was said. And that's why sometimes you hear the wrong thing and it sounds like maybe someone was going to say one thing, or someone said one thing, you heard it as another thing, and it feels like you perfectly heard them say that other thing. Whereas when you're like, "What?" they say it again and they say something that sounded totally different. So again, I'm just trying to make the point that your brain although it might feel like you heard something perfectly, in reality, you might have only heard it 70% and your brain filled in the last 30% with its knowledge of what the word was that it deduced from the context. And so that's basically what's happening is you haven't fully developed your ability to hear all the sounds in the language, but because you have knowledge of the language, sometimes your brain's able to figure out certain words. And when that happens, it feels like you just heard it perfectly. But in reality, that wasn't what happened. It probably was still that you didn't quite make it out perfectly, but it was enough for your brain to deduce what word it was when combined with the other knowledge. And the only solution to this is doing a bunch more listening. You get better at hearing the sounds naturally the more that you immerse in the spoken language. So Hayden asks, "Hey Matt, I love the Japanese language. I think it's very expressive, simple, and very creative. There are some things that irk me though, especially when it comes to reading kanji, which I find very inconsistent at times. For example, there is a place in Final Fantasy XIV called Kokui Mori, but the voice actors will read this as Kokui no Mori. Kokui no Mori. Kokui no Mori. I don't know the pitch accent of it. Even if there is no written." And then he goes on to give probably 10 examples of other just surprising kanji readings that threw him off and maybe frustrated him. And then at the end he says, "I was wondering, or I have a lot more examples, but I think you get my point. It's stuff like this that gets me a bit confused and frustrated when reading. I was wondering if you feel the same way or have similar experiences that have gotten you frustrated. I guess I should just stop being lazy and use the dictionary instead of trying to read things I'm not 100% sure." So yeah, basically kanji readings are not consistent. That is definitely a true fact. Although when you get good at kanji, you can make very educated guesses as to how a kanji will be read, and you'll be right more than you're wrong. You can never know for sure. So I never, ever assume that a kanji is read a certain way without checking it first. So whenever I was reading a book and there was a kanji, even if I thought, okay, 90% chance it's read like X, I'd always look it up and check, because I never wanted to accidentally build a bad habit. I wouldn't want to see a word, make up a reading or guess a reading, have it actually be wrong, but then I just solidify it in my mind. So then the next time it comes up, I feel like I know the reading. And then when I say the word, I say it wrong, and I'm just unaware that I mislearned a word. So I was always scared of that happening. So I would always look words up in the dictionary and check how they were actually read, and would make cards for anything that I thought I wouldn't be able to just remember naturally. So yeah, to be honest, it doesn't really frustrate me. I mean, I guess it's annoying on a certain level, but I've never really been frustrated because that's just my expectations. That's just the nature of kanji, right? I do have a video called Japanese Kanji Suck, and I do think that, it's not really ideal for the written language to be so inconsistent and unpredictable. And I think that it is kind of dumb, especially when it comes to names, and even native speakers can't read the names of people who they don't already know specifically know how it's read. In certain situations, now of course most names people can read no problem, but I think I've told the story before. I remember when I was studying abroad in Japan, on the first day of school, the teacher was going down the attendance list and basically taking attendance, and 1 in 5 names, he wasn't confident in the reading. He would say it out loud, with the question mark in the end, and be like, "Is this right?" And sometimes he would get it wrong. So I think that that's kind of ridiculous that happens in a language, but it's also just the reality. It also is part of the reason why there's a lot of flavor in Japanese and room for creativity when it comes to kanji. So you just got to set your expectations right, and don't just expect that you're going to be able to guess the reading and get it right and then be frustrated when it's wrong. You just have to know, yep, I don't know how a kanji is read until I've double checked it. And then you won't be frustrated because it'll just be exactly what you're expecting. And then Hayden also asks, P.S. Just another thought. How do I read this kanji? Moguru or kuguru? So yeah, the moguru and kuguru, they're written the same way, but they mean two different things. So kuguru is to go through something, and moguru means to go into something, to go underground. And so yeah, sometimes, so you just got to learn. They're two separate words. They happen to be written the same when they're in kanji form, but I would just think of them as two different words. So Alfie asks, what are some of your general thoughts on the area between free flow immersion and a very high concentration with very frequent lookups? So yeah, in Refold, we refer to very high concentrated with very frequent lookups as intensive immersion. We have this dichotomy between free flow immersion and intensive immersion. And I think we talk about on the Refold website that this distinction does start to break down as you reach a higher level, right? The distinction is only really strong when you're at a lower level and they look very different. But once you can already understand things just fine, then you don't have to strictly be in one mode or the other. You can just mostly be in free flow, except you look things up every now and again because there only are a couple things every now and again that you want to look up in the first place. So eventually the two different types of immersion kind of collapse into one and you just have a kind of middle ground that you're on. Although, of course, you're probably going to look more or less things up depending on your energy level. That's always true. And so what are my thoughts on the area between? I mean, yeah, of course, it's a spectrum. The reason why we have two clear names like free flow and intensive is because that makes it easier to talk about and conceptualize, right? If we're just always saying, oh, there's this spectrum with infinite positions between one end and the other end, then it's hard to give concrete instruction, right? When we say like, okay, we're going to pose that there's these two ends of the spectrum and you want to do this end this amount of time and this other end this other amount of time. It's easier to communicate and for people to digest and to implement. Of course, once you get experience, then you'll be able to tread this continuum freely and you won't have to necessarily be thinking about what am I in this category or this category. You can just know where on the spectrum will be best for you. But I think that, yeah, it's going to be difficult for people to do that right off the bat, which is why we have these categories. But yeah, of course, you want to have some time where you're not looking anything up because that teaches your brain that it's important to be able to understand things on the first go. It also helps you train your ability to predict what things mean and get by even when you miss something. Because in a real life conversation, you can't just pause and look things up. You can't rewind. You have to be able to just go with it. So first of all, you have to be able to understand almost everything. And even when you miss something, you have to be able to roll with the punches, so to speak, and be able to still follow along with what's happening and not get totally lost. So free flow immersion is really important training for real life in that perspective. But yeah, of course, in general, the more that you look things up, the more that you're going to learn to an extent, because if you're looking too many things up, then it takes you out of the experience and then it becomes too much of an intellectual exercise. But I think that all of this, it gets very intuitive. So if you feel like you're at the point where you can drop these categories and just intuitively maneuver the territory, then definitely do that. Kyle Huntman asks, have you ever considered being a monk? Yeah, I've actually considered being a monk many times. I haven't been thinking about it that much recently, but I think there's a decent possibility that I'll be a monk at some point in my life. Like, actually, I have a kind of group of meditation friends who I meet with. I mean, I was meeting with pretty regularly before the pandemic. And there was someone who would come to our group sometime who had been a monk for a couple years. And he was a pretty normal dude. I mean, very chill. Maybe chiller than the average dude. But yeah, he had been a monk in Burma for a couple years. So to me, that's a very real thing because, I actually know people who have lived as a monk. So something I'm very interested in. It's kind of like the meditation equivalent of doing all Japanese all the time, right? So of course you make the most progress on the spiritual path when that's literally all you're doing and there's no distractions. It also just sounds kind of nice, although I'm sure it would be very intense and very hardcore and not, it would not be a walk in the park. But it would be nice in the sense of you can just, like my personality type, I like to just focus on one thing very intensely and not have to worry about balancing the other practical aspects of my life. So being a monk would give me an opportunity to do that for meditation. So I definitely think at some point in my life that it's pretty likely I might become a monk. But right now, have a lot of exciting stuff going on. And so it's not really something I'm thinking about at the particular moment. Joey Jordanson asks, I would say on average, watching an episode of anime takes me about 30 minutes instead of 20 because I like to rewind sometimes or look words up. So taking that into account, if I were to watch 6 episodes of anime, would this be considered 2 hours of active immersion or 3? And also, how did you personally track your active immersion time when you watched anime? Because I know you said in the past you watched about 6 episodes per day. So this is a pretty interesting question. I never actually thought about this in particular. And what I would say is that probably the better you get, the less the gap between the length of the show and the length it takes you to watch a show is going to be. So when you're a beginner and you're doing intensive immersion, it might take you twice as long to consume a piece of content. So if you have a 20-minute piece of content, it might take you 40 minutes to consume, potentially even longer, and that's okay. So when you're at the beginning of the process, you probably want to count how many minutes or hours you're actually spending, not how many minutes or hours the content is, just because the gap's going to be so big that that's what's going to give you a more realistic representation. But once you get better, the gap gets smaller and smaller, and at a certain point, it might not really matter so much anymore, or maybe it'll just be more convenient for you to track the hours of content that you watch, not the amount of time you spent watching the content. So in my case, I mostly just tracked how many anime episodes I actually watched. So if it took me, well, I mean, first of all, I actually thought in the unit of anime episodes. So I wasn't even thinking in terms of time. Like a lot of times I would think like, okay, today I watched 6 anime episodes. And if I watched a drama, one drama episode is generally twice as long as an anime episode. So I just think of that as 2 anime episodes. So in my mind, anime episodes was like a unit of measurement that I would use just for myself, because I wasn't talking about this to anybody. So it didn't have to make sense to anyone else but me. And so, yeah, I mean, the real important thing is that your way of measuring, I mean, like, it depends on your goals. I've talked about in the past how you can measure for the sake of science or you can measure for the sake of personal improvement. If you're measuring for the sake of personal improvement, all that matters is that you're using a consistent way of measurement so that your measurements mean the same thing across time. If you're talking about for the sake of science, that's like the reason you're measuring, because you want to have data at the end of like once you reach fluency on exactly how long it took you to reach fluency. Then, I mean, what you're aiming for is the amount of time you spent listening to the language. So strictly speaking, if you rewinded, that would count, because if you watch a sentence and then rewind and watch the sentence again, well, you just consumed that sentence twice. So both times count as immersion. Whereas the time where you're not consuming and you're just looking things up in the dictionary, assuming that you're not using a monolingual dictionary, then that wouldn't count because you're not actually contacting the language in a meaningful way during that time. So obviously, realistically, you can't measure down to the second like this and be like, okay, I'm going to measure when I'm going to count it when I rewind, but I'm not going to count it when I look at things up. So you got to be pragmatic at a certain point. So what I'd say is probably, like I mentioned at the beginning, then probably count the amount of time that you are spending, regardless of how much content you get through. And then maybe at a certain point, just switch over if it makes sense for you, because that would be an easier way, or just feels like it makes more sense for you. If not, I think it's fine to always count the amount of time you actually spend. I don't think there's any problem with that. For me personally, I always was trying to get myself to pause and rewind less because, you know, I'm neurotic, I'm a perfectionist. So I was always trying to push myself into the direction of tolerating more ambiguity, because I knew that that would get me through more content total and that would be beneficial in the long term. So tracking the number of anime episodes that I finished was a way for me to push myself to not look as much things up, because I knew that I wanted to get through as many episodes as possible, and the more I look up per episode, then the fewer episodes I'm going to get through total. So that way of measuring helped me and my personality, because I was neurotic. But if you're the opposite way and, you know, you're someone who doesn't look enough things up, then maybe you'll want to do the opposite and measure the amount of time you spend watching to take the pressure off yourself and say, you know, it's not going to affect my score, so to say, if I look things up, so I might as well take my time. So I think overall, like at the beginning, like I said, no matter who you are, you probably want to measure in terms of the time you're spending, not the content you're consuming. But after you get past the beginning phase and the gap isn't so big, you probably want to choose pragmatically based on what makes sense for you and your personality. So Cam asks, my question is about how to use frequency lists to pick up words to make cards for. For context, I'm a Japanese learner at stage 2B with 2,500 sentence cards. When immersing and doing lookups, I don't mind anything over 10,000, but I feel like I'm being too neurotic about it, and also it feels like this biases me away from important but specific terminology for my domains. For example, in school life / slice of life type shows, the word for the track and field club can be important, but it's not very common overall, so how should I decide how much to take frequency into account? I mean, honestly, I wouldn't take it into account that much at all. I personally never used a frequency list when I was looking things up because, like, first of all, frequency lists are going to be very different from one another depending on what sources were used to create them. So if you have just some general Japanese frequency list that's for everything, that's going to be very different than a frequency list made specifically for anime. And so if you're referencing that overall frequency list, it's not really going to be guiding you in direction you want to go in, because if you're mostly immersing with anime, then the only thing that matters is that you're growing your comprehension of anime. So like, for example, in your case, the word for the track and field club is probably important, yet your frequency list might not reflect this. But even if you have a frequency list made specifically for anime, again, it's going to depend on the show. And overall, also, in the long term, right, you want to be able to understand everything. So even if you learn one random word that maybe isn't the most useful at that moment in time, well, you're probably going to want to know it eventually anyway, assuming you want to get to a high level of fluency. So it's not like you're missing out that much, right? And the other thing is that if you make cards for words that stick out for you or feel interesting or just happen to have come in a sentence that's really cool, so you want to put that in Anki, that gives you this kind of emotional benefit of it's going to be easier to remember and more enjoyable to review, because things that are interesting are inherently easier to remember. So I think that whatever like efficiency loss that you experience through not referencing an actual frequency list, you'll regain in efficiency through enjoying the process more and just finding it more interesting. So the memories are going to be easier to make and they're going to stick better throughout time. And the other thing is you can normally just use your common sense. Like I would still think about frequency, but not through referencing a list. I just use common sense. Like if you look up a word and it's like the name of some specific flower or some scientific compound that you don't even know of in English, then obviously you probably don't need to know that, right? Whereas a word like track and field club, probably that's a pretty basic word that you're going to want to know. So I would just use a combination of using your common sense and your interests to guide you, as well as, you know, if something feels familiar, that's a sign that you've probably seen it many times in the past, which is in turn a sign that it's probably common. So prioritize those things. If something feels like you've literally never seen it before, then maybe think twice about whether you really want to add it or not. But overall, if you just use your common sense in this way, you won't be guided too far astray. Plus, it's just more enjoyable. You don't have to worry about being neurotic. And so that would honestly be my suggestion. So I think if you're going to use a core deck, you want the deck, like, for example, in stage 1 of Refold, when you're learning vocabulary with a pre-made deck, obviously that deck should be based on frequency so that it gives you the most bang for your buck. But when it comes to mining, so much of mining is about what sentence stuck out to you, what words stuck out to you, what appeals to you, what makes sense to you. And so I don't really think you need to be always referencing it to a frequency list that much, especially if you feel like it's leading to you being neurotic. So what I would say is, since up until now you've always been using a frequency list, well, try the other opposite. Try going no frequency list for a month or two, see how that feels, and then maybe you can think about finding a middle ground. And I think right now you've never experienced anything but using a frequency list, and so going from that to being more moderate about it is actually probably going to be harder than just going to the opposite extreme and throwing out the frequency list. And once you have direct experience from both sides of the spectrum, then you'll probably be able to much naturally find where on that spectrum is best for you. And maybe you'll settle with something in the middle. But even so, I think you're only going to be able to really do that once you've experienced the other extreme. So that would be my suggestion. So Shkabak asks, so I've been doing this thing for 3+ years now, and I've come to finally accept some basic truths about myself. For one, I just don't like to read. I can have bursts of motivation where I read consistently for a month maybe, but I always burn out. I even got through school basically not reading any books in English. And after using WaniKani for a year before finding you, and then using Anki a bunch since then, I have a really hard time staying consistent with flashcards. So burnt. I guess my question is, what do you recommend for someone like me? It's not like I haven't gotten better at Japanese after 3+ years, but building vocabulary without reading or flashcards seems pretty daunting. Can one become fluent in listening through immersion and lookups and worry about repping flashcards for kanji readings after they already know most words? It seems like this scenario would yield the lowest bar for making and reviewing flashcards. For reference, I would say I'm around level 3 or 4 comprehension in both listening and reading, depending on the domain. I understood virtually the whole Japanese conversation you and George had on that long-ass live stream. And then he kind of added in a second comment. To put it into simpler terms, what are your current thoughts on learning to listen first and then learning to read? I'm sure your answer would change slightly when responding to a beginner, and please feel free please feel free to express those thoughts. But how would you answer that question coming from a more intermediate learner who already has kanji fluency and the basics down? Yeah, so first of all, it's definitely possible to learn entirely through listening. And actually, I have a friend right now who's overall either just as good at Japanese with me or perhaps even better. He's definitely better at speaking. I'm probably better at reading and writing. But he learned entirely through listening, and he didn't learn how to read Japanese, as far as I understand, until he already had basic fluency. And so it's definitely possible. And there's lots of people like this, right? I mean, first of all, we all learned our native language through listening alone without reading or flashcards. So it's definitely possible. Oh yeah, and by the way, this person who I just mentioned, they also didn't use any flashcards to learn the language. So yeah, it's definitely possible. And I think that in general, yeah, some people are readers and some people aren't readers. Some people just don't like reading in any language, and it's just easier for them to learn through the medium of listening. And I think if you're this type of person, which my friend who I just mentioned is, and it sounds like you are, then it probably is or might be the best path for you to not worry about reading so much and just take that listening approach. Now, for a lot of people, this is going to be the approach that is way harder. I'd say for the majority of people, this is going to be a real uphill battle because on the surface, reading is just inherently easier than listening. All the words are right there. You can look them up. You can easily make flashcards for them. And it's just, they're so much more concrete for most people than the spoken language. And so it's just way easier. But for some people, maybe this isn't the case, and it's just easier for them to learn through listening, or at least maybe they enjoy it more. So if this is the case, then I'd say just go with it, especially because if you learn entirely through listening, that's going to lead you to have really strong pronunciation and a really good ear later on down the line. This friend that I just mentioned who learned entirely through listening, he has one of the best accents in Japanese that I've ever heard from a Westerner. And he actually did have to work a little bit on his pitch accent consciously to perfect it, but probably even before working on it consciously, it was probably really good, like way better than mine was before I started working on it as well. And he also, now his pitch accent is better than mine. It's way more accurate because he knows it intuitively, whereas I still, have to sometimes think about it and stuff. So there are a lot of benefits to learning through listening. The reason that I don't recommend it to everybody is because, like I said, for most people, it would be the uphill path, and it would just take longer total as well because it's so much easier to learn through reading. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, there's no one path that is ideal for everybody, and you got to play to your strengths. You got to do what works for you. And so I'd say it's definitely possible. Like I said, I probably imagine it probably takes longer to learn through reading, but there's other benefits that come with that as well. So if you've given the flashcard path and the reading path a real shot and it's just not for you, then I think you got to trust your experience and try the listening path. And by the way, when I say reading path, watching target language content with target language subtitles counts as the reading path, because although I do consider that a hybrid activity, watching with TL subtitles, it's probably closer to reading than to listening. So yeah. So Simple Milk asks, where in the Refold stage spectrum would you recommend for learners of Japanese to start studying and perceiving pitch accent? What stage would be late enough that it would become very hard to learn pitch accent? So I'd recommend giving yourself a basic introduction to pitch accent right from the beginning at stage 1, just in terms of learning how pitch accent works and what patterns there are. Maybe I'm talking about 30 minutes total of knowledge just to plant the seed. You don't have to try to understand it perfectly because you probably won't, but at least plant the seed that pitch accent is a thing. It's kind of like this, and that already is going to give you a leg up. Then probably around stage 2B, you want to set aside some time to train yourself to perceive the 4 pitch accent patterns. And that really goes a long way in having you develop good pitch accent, because the ability to hear it and be aware of it, that is by far the most important factor. And if you're really serious about getting a good accent, then maybe start learning the pitch accent of all the words you learn in Anki at that point around stage 2B as well. But if you're not that concerned with having a super good accent, I would still recommend training yourself to hear the patterns, because that's going to give you a lot of bang for your buck, but maybe you don't worry about memorizing the patterns of all the words. And at what point would it be late enough that it would become very hard to learn pitch accent? Basically, after you've already reached basic fluency in speaking. once you reach basic fluency in speaking and you kind of develop a lot of habits related to speaking, then going back and like integrating pitch accent into that is going to be really difficult. And that's my experience. I had a really hard time learning to speak with good pitch accent, and I still struggle with it. I'm still far from perfect, because it's a lot harder to go back and change bad habits than to build good habits the first time. It's like a completely different neural process. So, when you have certain pathways in your brain that you've established, they never fully go away. They can atrophy to a degree, but it's like we say in Refold, when you fold a paper and you unfold it, that crease is always there. It never 100% goes back to the state of not having been there. And fixing pitch accent after you already have habits related to speaking is just infinitely harder than getting it right the first time. I know that's a harsh truth, but that is my experience, and to this day, I struggle immensely with speaking with good pitch accent because of the way that I learned and the point in my journey that I learned. So a lot of people have this idea that, I'll worry about pitch accent after I'm already perfect with everything else, but that is probably not going to go down as well as you're thinking. So Vinci Shi asks, "Hey Matt, so I was raised bilingually, speaking and surrounded by both Chinese and English. My question is, if I still speak and hear Chinese every day, when studying Japanese, will I be able to pick up pitch accent more through immersion, or would I still need to consciously study it like other Westerners or native English speakers?" So from what I've seen, in general, Chinese people do pick up pitch accent much more naturally than Westerners do, but it's not a surefire thing. There's some Chinese speakers who still totally mess up pitch accent. There's other Chinese speakers that get it pretty much perfect with no extra work. So it's kind of a mixed bag. I'd say you're probably going to be, like, even if you never consciously study it, you're still going to be much better off than your average English speaker. But if you're really concerned with reaching as close to perfection as possible, you probably still want to put some conscious work into it. So Max Harris asks, just a fun quick question for you. How many years into your language learning experience did you get to a point where the words being consumed moved you, e.g. cried in a movie or died of laughter at a joke? So actually really early on, when I first read this question, the first thing that came to mind was I was probably less than 6 months into AJAT, maybe just a couple months into AJAT, and I watched the anime Anohana. The real name's really long. I don't even know if I can remember the whole thing. If you type in Anohana, it'll definitely come up. And I remember I think I almost cried watching that show. And I don't even think I fully understood it, but I understood enough of it, combined with just the amazing art and music and the emotionality of the climax of that show, that I was totally moved while watching that. And it was entirely in Japanese. I was watching it with Japanese subtitles, no English at all. So yeah, I actually don't think you need to know that much of a language in order to be moved. That was my experience. Of course, the better I get, the more often it happens, because sometimes language ability can get in the way and hold you back. But okay, last question. Polars asks, in the March Q&A, you talked about how you prefer reading and listening to be separate activities, and you found it inefficient to listen to audiobooks and read them at the same time in comparison to doing one or the other. Does this also apply to watching shows in your target language with target language subtitles? I'm asking because I heard you say multiple times in the past that watching with target language subtitles can be a good way to improve your reading ability, and I'm wondering if you changed your mind on this, or if there is something fundamentally different between audiobooks and shows in which you are listening and reading at the same time. Yeah, so I actually noticed after I filmed the March Q&A, I actually thought, oh wait, is this going to sound like a contradiction to people? How come I say that you should watch content with target language subtitles, but that I don't prefer listening to audiobooks while reading at the same time? Because they're basically the same activity. And I haven't changed my mind on anything. I still don't really like the activity of listening to audiobooks and reading at the same time, but I still am a huge fan of watching target language shows with subtitles. And the difference in my mind is that when you're watching shows with target language subtitles, your experience is going to be different depending on where you are in the process. So in the case of something like learning Japanese, right? In the very beginning, the reason why you want to have Japanese subtitles on is just to give yourself more opportunities to practice kanji recognition. Because at the beginning, you're in the current model, you're going through the JP1K and you're exposing yourself to a lot of kanji, but any extra exposure that you can get is going to be really beneficial. So although, of course, you're not going to be understanding very much of the subtitles or the audio at this point, and it's going to be too fast for you to really see what's going on, it does just give your brain more opportunities to get used to seeing kanji and recognizing kanji, and you will be able to pick out some of the words that you know. So it's a little different than reading a book while listening to the audiobook, because you're not really reading all the sentences. You're just letting yourself be exposed to them. You're like getting flashed to them, basically, right? It's almost like subliminal at a point, because it's so fast, you're not going to be able to read it. And then when you move into stage 2, when you're using the subtitles, a lot of times you're going to be actually pausing after each subtitle line and taking as much time as you read. So that's a very different activity. You're basically pausing, reading the line, and then listening to it, or listening to it, then pausing, and then reading. So the time element isn't really an issue. Whereas for me personally, when I'm listening to an audiobook and reading it at the same time, my brain wants to do one or the other, and the fact that I can't do both at the same time is what makes it feel like not the most helpful activity to me. And then the other thing with watching content with subtitles is that once you get pretty good, you can do both at the same time, because dialogue comes in little bite-sized chunks. So for me, like when I watch a show in Japanese with Japanese subtitles, I can read the subtitle line in like a second or two before the person has even spoken the entire thing. Or because I can read it so quickly, even if I don't finish reading it before they start speaking, my brain can process it all at once, because it's just one little bite-sized chunk of language, right? It's like a sentence or two. Whereas with reading, they're not bite-sized. They're generally long sentences, and they're just non-stop, right? There's just a little more breathing room when you're watching a show generally. And so that makes it easier for my brain to be able to do both I'm not really doing both at once. Most of the time I'm like reading it really quickly, and then I'm listening to the person say it. And so for me personally, it just feels like a different activity for me to watch a show with subtitles versus listening to an audiobook while reading. And still, I would say that the way that we kind of formulate things in Refold is that during stage 2, that's the stage when you're watching content with target language subtitles, and you're doing that because you want all the help that you can get. When you're watching with subtitles, that's not the best listening practice, and it's not, if you're pausing, then that is really good reading practice. If you're not pausing and you're just letting it go by, that's not the best reading practice either. But because you get to benefit from your reading ability and your listening ability at the same time, that's going to lead to you having the highest comprehension. And that's the most important factor for stage 2 of Refold. But once you get comfortable with watching with subs, then you want to start doing more raw listening, or I think we call it pure listening and pure reading, because the best reading practice is when you're just reading, and the best listening practice is when you're just listening, and you're not kind of cheating by using your other ability. It's kind of like if you want to build a muscle, you have to work out that muscle. Like if you want to, for example, build your bicep, then you can't just use your other arm to do the exercise for you, right? You have to use the bicep. So if you want your listening ability to get better, you have to use your listening ability as much as possible, and not be able to cheat by just looking at the subs. And same thing with reading. You have to be able to parse the grammar of complex sentences without hearing the intonation pattern and having that give away the way that the grammar should be parsed. So I still think that watching with subs is really helpful early on, but for me, early on, you're not even probably books and audiobooks are going to be too hard anyway. And by the time you get to the point where you can meaningfully read a book and listen to an audio and really go along with it, then I think it'd probably be better to just do them separately. At least that's my experience. Because like I said, when I try to listen to an audiobook and read at the same time, it feels like my brain is just constantly flickering back and forth between the two, and it can't just focus on one. And that's what it wants to do. But that's my mind. Other people apparently have much different experience with this activity, and it works really well for them. And so I'd say if listening to an audiobook and reading the text at the same time works well for you, and it's a good way for you to consume the language, then I'd say definitely go with that. It's mostly just my personal hang up that I don't personally enjoy the activity. But yeah, something about the fact that when you're watching a TV show with subtitles, every sentence comes in little bite-sized chunks, and there's more breathing room, that makes it subjectively feel much different to me. And that's why I like watching with subs, but not really listening to audiobook while reading the text. So yeah, in conclusion, for me, each activity feels a little different, and I like one and not the other. But if it works well for you, then definitely do that. with the caveat that, like I said, eventually you have to learn how to read without listening and listen without reading if you want to get strong in each of those abilities. So yeah, that's this week's Q&A. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you guys so much for supporting. Leave your questions on this post, and I'll see you guys in the next one.